Welcome to Books in the World, a production of the Cape Cod Writers Center for over 40 years. I'm your host, Elisa Metcalf, and today I am excited to welcome Calvin Hennick, author of Once More to the Rodeo, a memoir that covers the 10-day trip Calvin took with his biracial son from Boston to his hometown in Maxwell, Iowa, population 800, where he ponders big questions like how, as a white man, can he possibly teach his young son what it means to become a Black man in America? And how can he expect to be a good man and father when he comes from a long line of lousy dads? Calvin, thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So let's talk about the book. You wrote this memoir during this journey you took with your son. And the trip, it seems, was planned for two reasons: to, as a bonding experience for you and he, but also to reconcile some things about your past.
Yeah, I very intentionally took my son Niall on this trip when he was 5 years old and about to enter kindergarten to try to, like, as you said, both, just have a fun bonding experience with my kid, but then also to really try to work some stuff out for myself about what type of father I wanted to be and how to be that type of father and how to raise him into the type of man that I hope he's going to be.
Well, tell us a little bit about your past and your history and what it was like growing up.
So as you said, my hometown is in Iowa, really tiny town, 800 people. And I kind of bounced around a little bit. I lived with both my parents for a few years, and they divorced when I was 3 or 4 and then lived together on and off. But when I was 11, I moved back to Iowa. I was out here actually for a couple of years on the East Coast, living with my mom and brothers. All this is laid out in the book, but it gets kind of confusing. And then I moved back to Maxwell when I was in 5th grade and lived with my grandparents. But not only did my dad leave when I was very young, and then when he was around, it wasn't great. But my grandfather, who took me in when I was in high school or middle school, he officially legally adopted me when I was 15, and then he left very shortly thereafter. So it was sort of this, deja vu experience of dads leaving, and that was part of what informs my kind of obsession with trying to be the best father I can be.
And he was your father's father, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So he had remarried. So your grandmother was, his newer relationship, and you moved in with he and her. Alice,
yeah, exactly.
Right? Wasn't her
Yep.
name Alice?
In the book, it is. It's a pseudonym, but yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. And it was rough because you say that, when you were a grandkid and, living there, and your mother, with your parents and everything, that they were the great grandparents, as all grandparents are. They were indulgent, loving, and sweet and kind. But then all of a sudden, when they became your parents, your legal parents, everything changed.
Sure. Yeah, that's true. I mean, I talk in the book about Special Day, which was Saturdays with my grandparents, and we would go out and they'd, say I could get a toy in a small box, not a big box, and I would stay with them on weekends. And it was just this incredibly loving relationship that, as I became a teenager and lived with them, really deteriorated and fell apart and wasn't a positive experience. And that was something I was trying to reconcile with myself about how this happens in a lot of families, I think, where relationships start out one way and then another way. And this question of whether you can do anything to prevent that, right? Because as I write in the book, my grandparents loved me as much when I was little as I loved my son when he was 5 and I was on this trip with him. And, of course, I knew then and know now that he's 5 years older, that he's going to grow up and have his own opinions. And, there's inevitably going to be points of friction in a parental relationship, but how to try to maintain that sort of fierce love that I've had for him since he was born, that I haven't necessarily witnessed in my own family lasting through a lifetime.
But at points, they were actually, mean to you. They were insulting and critical of a lot of things, which must have been extremely difficult.
It was. I mean, I try, memoir is tricky because you try to never write from a place of score settling or trying to, out somebody's bad behavior or anything like that. And I mean, in the book, you see that Alice's and my relationship continued to evolve over time after, I turned 18 and left the house. And, it was a big sigh of relief for me to leave the house, but it wasn't the type of relationship that ended right there. It continued to evolve over time. And she ended up loving Niall the same way she loved me when I was a little boy. And that sort of, in a way, brought us full circle back to, the way things started out positively. And there's sort of the thing that happens in families, I think, where you don't talk about the middle part. You don't necessarily always, sometimes working through things and working through the pain, and it does involve, not always everybody having that difficult conversation. That doesn't always happen. I feel like the way family stories are told a lot of times, and redemption arcs are told, that we feel like there has to be this moment of catharsis. And a lot of times we don't really know how we end up in life in a certain place with certain people, and we just kind of get there. And so I was trying to investigate that a little bit.
Right. You talk about, your life doesn't always have this perfect narrative arc that, as writers, we hope it might.
Sure. Exactly.
So when, when you said you were 11 when you moved back to Iowa, when you made the choice.
Yeah.
So that must have been a very difficult decision for a young child. I mean, how bad were things in Massachusetts that, this was an option?
I wasn't a very popular kid, I'll tell you that. And I had spent these idyllic summers in Iowa with my grandparents, and sort of thought life would be like that when I moved back. And it wasn't, both in terms of the home life, but then also wherever you go, there you are, right? And being an unpopular kid in one place, I brought the same lack of social skills that I had when I was 11 to Iowa with me. And that's another thing I talk about in the book is, the things we pass on to our children, and thinking that you can spare them somehow from the mistakes that you've made, or the sort of quirks of personality that you've got. And a lot of times you see, you look at your kid and you see a carbon copy of who you were at 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, and you go, well, at least I know he's mine, right?
This book was really a really searching and fearless moral inventory, because a lot of it, you do not try to paint yourself in this great light. I mean, you are very honest about some of your own character flaws, and, the struggle to get through them and try to be the best person you can be.
Well, I think that's one of the challenges of parenting is, I think very few people set out to be a bad parent, that no one has a kid and says, all right, I want to mess them up and I want to have a terrible relationship. I think there's some handful of people, some of whom are in my life, that are maybe indifferent towards that relationship, but very few people set out to fail, right? And so, there are moments you see in the book where you can tell that I'm trying really hard to be a good dad, and I'm just not doing it, even in the moment, even, on the trip, while I know I'm going to be writing down everything that I say and do, because I knew I was writing the book when I took this trip, that it's just sometimes you are in a battle with yourself to be the best version of yourself. And that takes on a whole other dimension and whole other set of stakes when you're a parent, I think.
Yeah, when you're still single, you can it's just your own way. There's not as much responsibility. So during this trip, you and Niall, I don't mean to kind of make it sound like it's this great soul searching, heavy book. This is, you're funny. And Niall is very funny. There are a lot of really funny parts about this book, and you capture them so wonderfully. And just, it's a road trip. So there's a scene where you are, I think you're in like a greasy spoon bathroom, and you're trying to, somehow the conversation comes up, well, when we get to Iowa, we're going to see, your father, Niall's grandfather. And you're like, yeah, no. And because, why? He obviously a 5-year-old, he's asking all these questions. And, you say, well, he's not a very nice person. And Niall says, well, you mean like, so if you say hello to him, he won't say hello back? Like that's from his perspective. And you capture his voice in the story. So, so perfectly. Like, how did you manage that?
I had a tape recorder going in my front pocket for a lot of the drive.
Whole time?
And not the whole time, but well, when I sort of, there were moments where he would be asleep in the car, and when he perked up and we were talking, because I wanted to make sure that I really did capture his voice and not do sort of my reconstruction of his voice. Obviously, I trimmed, I didn't put everything a 5-year-old said in 10 days in the road trip, because no one would have wanted to read
sequel, that. Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. But I very consciously wanted to accurately convey what his personality was like, because he really is a character in the book. That's one thing. I think, when I was first sending the book out to agents and stuff, people were a little worried, I think, about the idea of a main character being a 5-year-old kid, because how much could this kid have to offer? But I think that kids, first of all, trying to explain the world to kids, it's interesting. Like you just said, an iffy parental relationship, or when we talk about racism, and trying to talk about racism in America in a way that a 5-year-old can understand, right? It really. It's funny because you have to boil everything down to its elements, but the elements are so complicated and there's so many that it's almost an impossible task.
During this trip, you bring up the issue of racism by talking about Jackie Robinson and baseball.
That's right. Yeah. Again, he was only 5 years old, and my wife and I knew when we had children that we would have to talk to them, obviously, about racism, that our children are biracial, and they're going to have to be prepared to enter an America where, obviously we're not in a post-racial society, right? If such a thing could even ever be said to exist. But so yeah, I started talking to him. We had talked to him very lightly about things, but we went to the Baseball Hall of Fame, and I used that as an opportunity to talk to him about Jackie Robinson and the integration of the major leagues. And it's interesting because it was one, a really useful entry point into that conversation, but it also lends itself almost to a falseness, right? Like the way that I learned about racism in schools was sort of a before and after, right? Like we used to do this bad thing, and then we stopped doing this bad thing. And you kind of get this sense that it's almost like a paternalistic, sort of white-centric view of racism. Like we did this bad thing, and then we stopped doing this bad thing. But then, as you get older and learn more about the world, you realize those bad things haven't stopped, that racism, and especially institutional racism, persists. Those things are really difficult to explain to a 5-year-old, or oftentimes to explain to adults. And so, yeah, the one thing I was really conscious of during this road trip and during that time in our lives is that this was going to be an evolving conversation, that this is going to be something that my son was both going to continue to be learning about throughout his life, but also that I would be continuing to learn about, and that pretty soon I'd be learning from him rather than the other way around.
And to go to Iowa, I mean, there's not a large Black population there. And there were members of your own family that you were going to see who have, some, antiquated views, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, we took the road trip in 2016, in the summer of 2016, during, when Donald Trump was leading the Republican primaries, and it didn't really seem, or I guess it was the summer, so he was receiving the nomination, and it, really didn't look like he was going to win, but there was this, sort of regardless of whether he won, I was learning a lot about the America that I lived in from the campaign. I think I say this in the book, but there had never been a major political candidate who I would have feared taking my family to one of their rallies before, regardless of, whatever end of the ideological spectrum. I wouldn't have been scared to bring my Black wife and biracial children to any other major candidates' rallies. And there were people getting punched at Trump's rallies. There was a very dark, window into the American psyche, I sort of thought at the time. I didn't put this in the book, not because I was trying to sanitize anything, but I just couldn't find a place for it. But we were back at the carnival in my hometown of Maxwell, and someone had written inside one of the porta potties in black Sharpie, Trump 2016 Beaners. So, I mean, just using a racial epithet, just really identifying their support for this candidate with their racism. Like those two were hand in hand, and they were, I guess, not proud of it enough to put their name with it, but they wanted everyone to know that. They wanted people to see that we support this person, and what it means is we don't like people who don't look like us.
So then, fast forward, what was it, 8 months later, and you're at a baseball game in Fenway.
Sure.
And have an incident.
Yeah, this was really surprising. I include this in the book as kind of like a flash forward in time, in the narrative of the book, because it's certainly not something that I expected to happen while I was writing. Um, but we took the road trip when Niall was 6, and when he was 5, and for his 6th birthday, I took him and his grandfather on my wife's side, so my wife's father, to Fenway Park for his first professional baseball game. And this was a weird time to be going to a game because it was the day after Baltimore Orioles player Adam Jones had been peppered with racial insults from the crowd. And it's just I spent that whole day sort of thinking, like, this doesn't feel like Boston to me. Like, I know Boston has a reputation of a really complicated and oftentimes dark history with racism, but this is where I'm raising my family, and it's where we've had good experiences, and I just sort of felt like this weird sort of thing in the air. Like, is this who Boston is? Is this still a relevant sort of reputation for this city? And then we got to the baseball game, and people were sort of cheering for Adam Jones, kind of giving him a hand and sort of acknowledging that that's not who we want to be. And then a black woman sang the national anthem, and I thought she did a great job. And she finished, and this white fan leaned over to me and said that she sang too long, and he called her the N-word just right in front of me, just with my biracial son and black father-in-law sitting right next to me. And I asked him to repeat himself, and he said it again. And I repeated it back to him. I was like, "Is this what you said? I want to make sure I got this right." And he said, "Yep," and I stand by it. And I was horrified, but also just confused. I'm not used to experiencing, because I'm a white man, I don't see racism that often, right? When white people think that racism doesn't exist, it's often because it's invisible to us. And here it was very visible to me. And I went and got an usher and sort of left my son with my father-in-law. I would have taken both of them if I'd sort of not been so stunned, but I got an usher, and the fan got kicked out of the game, and it made these big headlines. And because it was in the news, I had to talk to Niall about it. He didn't know anything about this when it happened, but the next morning I sort of told him, what happened, and he was really upset and confused. Even though he didn't witness it happen, I was surprised by the impact it had. For months, he was worried about being in big crowds. What if someone like that man is there? But that morning, it was really touching and heartbreaking. He sort of said, "Daddy, I thought that was over, black people and white people not getting along." And it just sort of went to show that this sort of sanitized version of American history of the before and after of racism is so untrue, and to leave the conversation there would have been to do a great disservice to him. And he's obviously seeing firsthand already, even when he was 6, and now the past few years with things that have been unfolding in the news, that's not the country we are still.
So you say in the book that you think the racism, the struggles with racism are, instead of moving forward, they are a pendulum that swings back and forth. So now in the last couple of years, we've seen a lot of protests, a lot of pushback for police reform. There's more awareness than we've seen in our recent lifetimes. Do you think that's still true, or do you think we're actually moving the line forward?
I mean, I think it's unknowable where you are in history until you look back on it, right? Until you see sort of how things unfold. But I will say that while we've seen a lot of activism, we haven't seen a lot of action. I don't think, at least. I was really encouraged in the weeks after George Floyd was murdered last summer, not obviously by the horrific events, but by the outpouring of public sentiment that where people seem to say, no, this has to stop. We need to make a change. I've seen lots of calls for increased, diversity in corporations and institutions. I've seen lots of calls for police reform. I haven't seen a lot of companies say, here are the steps we're taking to make sure a certain number of our board members are people of color. I haven't seen many police departments saying, we recognize that this is a problem, not with communities, but with the way communities are policed, and here's how we plan to fix it. I haven't seen that. And maybe I'm missing certain, windows of hope, but I do still think that we're, on the knife's edge of kind of being in a sort of dark place. But I think, history is filled with times that are both simultaneously hopeful and dark. And I have a lot of hope for, what America can be. But no, I unfortunately haven't seen the kind of movement that I would like to, and that I think a lot of people would like to on these issues.
So back to the story, when you get to Iowa, you didn't ultimately, see your father or reconcile, with him in any way. What was the choice there?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to consciously not make anything I did in the book a stunt for the book. I wanted it to reflect real life and be true to how I think real life plays out. And it probably would have been a better book or a more saleable book if I'd had this big knockdown, drag out
It's
fight
a great
with
book.
Thanks. No, but I mean, it would have been a more incendiary climax if I'd been, screaming in the street at my racist father in front of my biracial son. But I wasn't going to put my son through that. I wasn't going to put myself through it either when I already knew what I'd be getting into. I mentioned earlier that I think that there's sometimes a falseness to these sort of family narratives where 20 or 30 or 40 years of pain is swept under the rug, and people pretend like, a cup of coffee and now I understand you. And sometimes there's nothing to understand. Sometimes you understand the other person perfectly well. And the choice to, the way I put it in the book, I think, is that the choice to hold on to your anger sometimes, I think, is the mature, more adult response than to pretend that things are better when they're not.
And perhaps, given your father's character and ability to parent, maybe the greatest gift he ever gave you was his absence.
I think about that sometimes. I don't think I would have benefited from more of my dad in my life. I sometimes, mourn the dad I don't have, but it's not the dad I do have that's not there. It's a, someone who's capable of, the type of support I see other people get, and the type of support that I hope that I'm able to provide, my own children. And when I say support, I don't just mean, financial. I mean, support in life.
So, writing a memoir is often cathartic for the author. Sometimes not so much for their family. Like,
Sure.
how was the book received with everybody that you care about?
Hit and miss. I've gotten some really nice responses. I've had some silences. I've had, some people not happy that I would choose to write about my family. But it's tough. I understand people's reactions. But I feel like, my job as a writer is to be as honest as possible and sort of searching. And like I said, I don't think that anyone gets, score settled or necessarily implicated in the book, despite the things I've just said about my father, who I think if anyone comes off pretty bad, it's probably him. But there are other people who, I think have done things that I wouldn't have done, but there are scenes of me doing things that 5 minutes afterwards I wish I hadn't done. And I think there's an acknowledgement, I hope so anyway, that readers walk away realizing that just because you did something bad doesn't mean you're a bad person, or just because, people aren't their worst moments. And a lot of people have a lot of regret about the way they've treated their families. And that's part of life too.
You share some of the, the hard writing in this, as you paint yourself, not at times, seriously flawed. And I mean, there's a heartbreaking scene, I thought, like when you and Niall are at the go-karts and
Sure, yeah.
you're trying to, you want him to go on the cart to have this fun, and he doesn't want to go, but then it really becomes more about you. But
Yeah.
it's your whole struggle, and you acknowledge this on the way that, but the struggle between you and Niall at the time was really hard to read. And I can only imagine how hard it must have been to write, because, you certainly were not trying to, flatter yourself in this book.
No, yeah. I mean, and like the scene you're talking about is almost silly when I look back at it. I'm trying to, I took Niall to, Niagara Falls specifically because there was a go-kart track and he'd wanted to go on go-karts since he was 2. And I was like, this is going to be it, father-son bonding and stuff. And then he got sort of overwhelmed by the sensory stuff, that the engines were too loud for him. And I had very little empathy in the moment for my 5-year-old son, who was just, there needing me to comfort him. And it's embarrassing to look back on. And that's why I say, like, I don't think that every bad parenting choice people make is because they're trying to be a bad parent or anything like that. And you wonder as a parent, I muse on this in the book, sort of like, what are your kids going to remember? Are they going to remember sort of, the sunshine coming out behind the clouds and the fun day spent together? Or is it going to be, my mom is like, you only remember the bad stuff. And, I worry about that with my kids too, that like 30 years from now, my son, having read the memoir by then, will be like, remember that time, Dad, in Niagara Falls?
Yes. And you also say in regards to your father that, it's, we're all flawed basically. And, that's some of us are unable to kind of get past our flaws, but what's inexcusable is not even trying. And that was the thing about your dad, is that he didn't even like try.
Yeah. I guess I don't get that, especially as a parent. Now that I'm a father, it's really hard for me to sympathize with, I think there are parents who, and it's oddly mostly fathers, I think women usually do stay, and the people who leave usually are men. And so I think a lot of people have these experiences where sort of a father, threw up his hands and said, all right, I'm done here. And it's really hard for me to understand that decision.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. We just have another couple of minutes. Is there anything else that you're working on right now?
I'm trying to work on a novel. We'll see how that goes. It's pretty early, but Niall has actually blossomed into quite a brilliant little artist, and he and I are working on a middle grade graphic novel about sort of bumbling criminals and arrogant police officers and fart jokes and all sorts of other stuff that appeals hopefully to 4th and 5th graders, and we're having a great time working on it together.
Well, I wish you the best of luck. And once again, this book, Once More to the Rodeo by Calvin Hennick, I highly recommend it. It's a great read. It's also an excellent tutorial for people who are interested in writing, an unabashed, honest memoir, because this is a really good example of that. And I enjoyed it thoroughly, and I look forward to anything else that you've got coming up, Calvin.
Thanks so much. Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thank you very much. This has been Books in the World, and we will see you next time.